So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Fiorenza Micheli. She's at Hopkins Marine Station, just down the road. Fio did her undergraduate work in Italy, and you're Florence, Florence, and then went to University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for her doctorate work, and then down at UC Santa Barbara for her postdoc work. One of the things that I really like working with Fio about is we've sat on a number of panels with her and workshops, and kind of this big picture stuff that she brings to the table. It's been great. You'll see some of that today, I think. Kind of marrying the sides of kind of the natural sciences with the human sciences, right, with the social sciences, and working with local groups. That's been great. Fio's been a past president of WSN, which something at Moss Landing, that's something that we're all very well aware of. And for those of you who are new, you will become aware of WSN. And so one of the other things to talk about Fio is she's another what I would call a Baja rat in a good way. When I came up here before, I talked a lot about the work I do in Alaska, but I really cut my teeth in the field working in Baja for 12 years. I'm going down, so we certainly have stomped a lot of the same grounds, although she's worked a couple of the offshore islands where I was working inshore, then a few of the places we shared. So it's always really nice to run into someone that's torn up and down that peninsula studying the kelp forests and the coastal ecosystems. So I'm hoping we're going to hear a little bit of that today. So I'm just going to leave it there, and without any further ado, have you give it a
Thank you, Matt, for a very nice introduction, and thanks for the invitation to come to Moss Landing and talk, in fact, about our work in Baja. So I'll focus on that project. But before I dive into the results from the Baja work and the reasons why we have set up our project the way we did, I'll get that in a minute, I want to ruin your dinner and this beautiful Thursday afternoon with some gloom and doom introduction about kind of the need and the urgency of working on climate change impacts on marine ecosystems. Climate change is a syndrome that comes with lots of different stressors and changes to marine ecosystems, and these add to a suite of anthropogenic stressors or local impacts to affect broadly marine ecosystems around the world. And not only the ecosystems, but from a human perspective, the delivery of services from these ecosystems. And one that is particularly important, of course, is the production of seafood. Fishery catches, at least from wild capture fisheries, have leveled off for nearly a decade now at 90 metric tons a year. They're not rising to meet the increasing demand from increasing world populations. There's an estimated 4 billion people that draw a significant fraction of their protein intake from seafood. And so we are faced with the challenge, basically, of meeting the demand for seafood. And then at the same time, there's yet more gloomy predictions about the kind of changes in fisheries production that might occur under climate change scenario. And this is a really nice paper by Chang, who used IPCC projections for climate change and a productivity model to project what might the changes in catches be in about 50 years from now under some of the IPCC scenarios. And so what this map shows is in the hot colors is where things get worse, so the bad news, and then in the cold colors where actually catches are predicted to increase. And there's a prediction particularly for tropical, subtropical areas, enclosed sea like the Mediterranean, that is very close to my heart, of course, is that the catches might decrease as much as 40%. However, productivity and climate are not the only term in the equation, because governance and what actually people do locally can also affect the responses of systems and fisheries to climate change and the resilience, perhaps, of systems to these changes. So if we zoom in from this global scale to what might happen locally, in Monterey Bay, for example, or in Baja, one of the questions I think that is fundamentally important to address is what are the conditions and the feedback at the local scale that affect the resilience of ecosystems and fisheries to climate variability. So this takes, like Matt was mentioning in his introduction, So to step out, in a sense, of our ecological comfort zone and enter in some difficult and sometimes very rewarding marriages with other disciplines, including the social sciences, and taking what's called the perspective of examining the dynamics of social ecological systems rather than just marine ecosystems. And so, for example, assessing the resilience of a fishery to climate variability requires looking at the vulnerability and sensitivity and capacity to adapt of the social system and how that combines with the vulnerability of the ecological systems to look at the overall resilience. So I'm going to dive into the system where we have been addressing this question, which is Baja California. And in this, we have chosen this system to work on small-scale fisheries because it provides some really nice feature of sort of getting rid of a lot of other human impacts. So I'll explain that in a minute. But we decided to focus on small-scale fisheries instead of large commercial fisheries, for example, because they're sort of the elephant in the room. They're very important, and yet we know far less about small-scale fisheries than large industrial fisheries. They employ a majority of people engaged in fisheries, and they produce an estimated half of the world catch, so they're important. They're also particularly vulnerable to impacts from climate change because of the limited resources that sometimes are available, the limited mobility, and the dependence of environments that tend to be fragile, like coral reefs, not fragile to climate change. So there's documentation of declines in small-scale fisheries and collapses associated with bleaching, for example, or extreme ENSO events. And Baja California is not an exception and has been, in recent years, affected by extreme ENSO events that have in turn affected the fishery. So this was for us, an important model to study the feedback between social and ecological systems, besides the fact that I'm a Baja rat and I love going to Baja and working there. So I've been doing this for the past 10, 15 years now. So a little background on the fisheries that we work in and how they're organized from a management and governance perspective. Here on the map, you see the outline of the marine territories that different fishing cooperatives have exclusive access to. So along the coast, each community have exclusive access to some species, like abalone and lobster, for example, inside these marine territories. And now, as I was mentioning, these communities depend almost exclusively on fishing as a source of income. This varies to a very great degree along the Baja Peninsula. And so in the Vizcaíno region, in the central area where we primarily work, there's very few other activities. That becomes less the case as you go north and south, where there's more tourism and other activities. So the fishermen are organized in cooperatives, and they work in a co-management system with the government to set quotas and regulations and monitor the resources. So it's a sort of a shared responsibility for the management of the fisheries. So the success story from these fisheries is the lobster fishery that received the certification as a sustainable fishery from the Marine Stewardship Council in, I believe in 2004 or 2006. It's been a while now, and it's been recertified. And the lobster fishery remains a success story. There's very limited impacts on the ecosystem that have been documented. The catches have been steady and, in fact, increasing with some record catches in the last few years. And so this is a fishery that is doing extremely well. And a simple explanation for this could go back to the exclusive access right and the territorial user right for fisher system that they have here. So one might expect success in fisheries when you have privileges, so you can essentially keep others away from the fishery, and so you know that we will reap the benefit of any restriction and any regulation that you put in the fisheries. access rights or exclusive access privileges create incentives for managing sustainably. In this case, the concessions are for 20 years at a time, so it's a very long time frame to know that you have access to that resource. And so they increase the likelihood of compliance in this and many other systems, as well as an ability to respond rapidly to change because of that constant monitoring, yearly monitoring that is done cooperatively in the co-management with the fisheries agencies. However, when then one looks more closely at this system, you can actually see that here and in many other parts of the world, the special user rights don't necessarily ensure sustainability of the fishery. And in fact, the same communities that have the eco label for lobster fishery have seen major decline in their abalone fishery over time with ENSO events and overfishing and overcapacity, lots of different reasons that we can discuss later, but they are losing one of their most valuable resources. And then also in those same territories, there's open access fisheries for finfish, for which the cooperative doesn't hold exclusive rights, so anybody can come in, and also those same cooperative fishers fish with essentially very limited regulation. And so we've documented very significant ecological impact both on the target resources and on the system. So basically, how does one try to make sense of what underlies these very different trajectories that different communities and fisheries have taken? How does one start to address all of these interactions that are happening at the same time? So the way we have sort of taken on this challenge is by putting together an interdisciplinary group of scientists, resource managers, fishermen, NGO staff. So it's basically taking in the various actors that are involved and addressing 4 different components, essentially. So we set out to first try to get a better understanding of the oceanographic variability, what is driving this, for example, the temperature extremes that have occurred in this system, what are the ecological responses to this variability, and then how do the communities respond, and what are the characteristics of the communities and the processes that determine what people will do in the face of, for example, a collapse of fisheries or open access and encroachment from other people. And then also sort of moving outside from this system, what are the kind of external drivers of resilience? And how does, for example, the presence of funders, of scientists, or of NGOs support or might enable resilience? So we are looking at these 4 different components. And so again, looking at this system, so we have the climate drivers, the ecosystem and the fishery, here, and then the focal fishing communities and the external support. The way that all of this may come together can take many different forms. Of course, there's lots of different ways in which this can play out. And oversimplifying perhaps what these outcomes may be, one can imagine that the ecosystem might respond to climate variability in at least 3 radically different ways. So we might expect that essentially everything dies, so everything is vulnerable, the system cannot support productivity anymore. There might be winners and losers with species, for example, exhibiting very different responses, and in fact some thriving under extreme climate conditions, or we may have ecologically resilient system. This, however, doesn't necessarily mean that fisheries will be sustainable and resilient, because these scenarios combine and interact with the scenarios for the social system, where in some cases communities may not have the resources or the will to adapt to change or to conserve their resources or to regulate their activities. And we call these crystallized communities. They're kind of stuck in doing what they do. They might be willing to make changes but have constraints that could be political, financial, social, or others, or they might in fact be able to adapt. And so depending on the combination of these different scenarios, you may have communities that are stuck in a poverty trap there, the red circle, and they can't really do much about climate change, or you may have communities that are actually able, for example, to recover their ecosystem by taking different actions. And one of these actions that communities have tried to recover ecosystem is establishing marine protected areas, or actually in this take, fully no-take marine reserves. So starting in 2006 and 2005, actually, we have collaborated with an NGO in Mexico that is called Comunidad en Biodiversidad in working with some of the local coastal communities in setting up marine reserves, establishing monitoring of the reserves, and training local fishermen to participate in the monitoring. So the first one was Isla Natividad, which is here of Punta Eugenia. Then following that, there was Bahia Magdalena, in Isla Magdalena, here of the Arro. And then we have El Rosario here, Punta Baja. Isla Guadalupe has been a long process, but apparently now they've decided to move forward. And then this year, La Bocana, right here, has also joined. And so we have coming up a whole series of initiatives that we undertake to decide where the reserves should go, their design, what to expect, what are the objectives, et cetera. So this is done in a participatory way where we have workshop with the fishermen. We use multi-criteria decision analysis to take in the information that they have about their fishing grounds and essentially weigh and come up with some alternative scenarios for where the reserves will go. So these are things like what's the ability to enforce the no-take regulation in different areas? No? Do they have boats? How far away is from the places that where actually they can get to? Things like that. What is the past productivity of some of these fishing grounds? What's the potential for recovery? Things like that. And then essentially they assess these things, and then we come up with some proposals for the design. And then the other element of the participation is that every 6 months, we present the results in the communities. In their every 6 months, the members get together to make a series of decisions. And so they give us some space in these assemblies where we present an update and to discuss what's happening. Then they participate also in the coastal oceanographic studies. So this is Charlie Bock, who's sitting right there. I can embarrass him. And he's a postdoc in this project, so I'll show some of his work later. And then this is Miguel Ángel Bracamontes, who's a fisherman in El Rosario, who's one of the divers that does the monitoring and also helps with the oceanographic studies. We go out and we do the work together, and then this is a group in Isla Natividad that got trained by Reef Check of California to do the monitoring in the reserves. And so it's standard PISCO-like or Reef Check-like monitoring. It's slightly modified, but it's counting kelps and fishes and identifying invertebrates and measuring abalone. And then they also, some of the members participated in some of the experiments we've done. So, for example, in Isla Natividad, we started all this in 2006, and then in 2009 and 2010, there were these mass mortalities of abalone where basically they had to shut down the fishery for that year. They tried it again the following year. They ended up closing it for good because the densities are minimal now in Isla Natividad. So that it's very similar, it's a completely different causal agent, but the sister mortality you've seen here. Well, now all of a sudden you start the animal dying, and within weeks there's shells everywhere. No, they're gone. So what we thought might have happened in this case is that during the time of the mortality there were prolonged low oxygen events, and so we sort of attributed this mortality to hypoxia. As, of course, like everything, as you keep studying it, it turns out that this initial hypothesis was wrong, and that is actually much more complicated. It turns out that it might be a combination of low oxygen and high temperature, or that actually these stressors might indirectly affect the animals. They might make them more sluggish or sort of impaired, and then more susceptible to predators. So it's actually not a direct relationship between low oxygen and mortality, or at least that we can show up to date. But for example, these are time series of oxygen concentration at 3 sites around Isla Natividad at about 12 to 14 meters depth on the bottom, so the different colors are different sites. And you can see oxygen concentration, whoops, let's see if it works, going down and periodically going at concentration as low as 2 milligrams per liter, which are lethal to a lot of organisms tested in the lab, and then staying below 4.5 milligram per liter for periods up to 3 weeks in some cases. So very extreme, prolonged, low oxygen events that have occurred. Of course, the phenomenon of hypoxia is now the object of a lot of studies in the California current and other upwelling systems. It's been proposed that the frequency, intensity, and duration of hypoxic event might in fact be getting worse as a consequence of climate change. One of the models for why this might happen is that high surface temperature might decrease the solubility of oxygen and also might increase stratification, and so decrease mixing and oxygenation of the deeper layers. And in fact, it has been documented that the upper depth of the oxygen minimum zone of Southern California has been shown, and this is work done by Stephen Bograd. So, no, it's not totally clear why we can get this low, prolonged oxygen event, but the hypothesis is that they might, or the prediction is that they might increase in frequency and extent. We did an analysis of oxygen concentration data of Southern California bite, because there's water quality agency there. They have been doing CTD casts in lots of different places since the 50s. And so we actually got this data set, and some of it was in boxes and had to be entered. You know? And Ashley Booth, who actually was a student here for a master, did an analysis of trends over time. And actually, you can see that the extremes in low oxygen and this duration have occurred starting in 2003 and not before when you go back to the 50s. So it does seem that whether it's associated with particular oceanographic conditions now or with actually an increasing trend, this particular decade seems affected by low oxygen events. So because we had the reserves in place, we actually had an opportunity to look at the response of some of the populations affected, abalone in particular, to the mortality events, and what's the function of reserves in potentially supporting the recovery of these populations. So what we found is that, in fact, reserves did play some role, or at least might increase the potential for recovery following mass mortalities. So what we documented is that the size frequency distribution of, in this case, pink abalone, after the reserve was established in the protected sites, shifts to larger sizes relative to before or to control sites. And these large animals, of course, produce more eggs. And when you estimate, so this is sort of an estimation, not a direct measurement, how many eggs are produced from the reserves relative to fish sites, what we saw is that with the mortality event in 2009, 2010, reproductive output, estimated reproductive output, remained higher in the reserve despite the very high mortality rates because of this effect of size. And this increased reproductive output actually did translate in increased recruitment. So we placed these collectors for post-larvae that are made of a patio umbrella stand filled with sand, with a PVC plate, and then this ondulated plastic that the communities there use in their aquaculture facility to capture the larvae of abalone. You put them in the field and bring them up every 2 weeks, and then under a scope you count how many post-larvae settled, and we deploy them in the reserves and in control sites. And what we saw is that the recruitment rates are in generally higher in the reserves than in the fish sites, and then they remained constant through the mortality event, despite a major, highly significant decrease in the density of adults, but decrease outside the reserves. we place these collectors that are symbolized here by the blue points at different distances from the edge of the reserves and look at how recruitment varies. And we found that there is this halo, basically, of highly variable recruitment around the reserves and some evidence of spillover. So we combined this with genetic studies where we looked at connectivity among different populations, and we used these estimates of dispersal and connectivity combined with the various demographic rates for growth and survival that we have from the field. And Giulio De Leo, his student Marisa Rossetto, and now his postdoc, Emil Alto, have produced a series of population models where they have examined the possible trajectories that are predicted for these populations under different scenarios of reserves, no reserves, different fisheries regulations. And so have seen that actually reserves might help recovery of abalone as long as these mortality events are not too frequent. And so when you then start having algae effects, like we might be seeing now, recovery is impaired. So what happens, and we've been focusing on abalone, but what happens when you look at the whole ecosystem and how have things changed through time? So here I'm going to show the results from the longest monitoring that we have, which is 10 years now in Isla Natividad, because the other sites we have shorter time series. And essentially, to kind of summarize what we have been seeing so far, fish and kelps haven't changed much. There's high year-to-year variability, but no strong overall trends over the 10 years. There have been major shifts in invertebrate assemblages with declines of abalones, urchins, and now several of the other species. And importantly, several of the species that have declined are the commercial species for which the communities have concessions. So here, it's a summary of the time series from the monitoring for species for which the community holds exclusive access rights, for the ones for which they don't, including some of the finfish. And so these are some of the trends I summarized earlier. This is, for example, sheephead and kelp bass. There's actually some increase. There have been maybe some good recruitment years that we're seeing now a few years later. For abalone, there's been the decline in 2009, 2010. The density have remained very low. Initially, these changes were compensated by a slight increase in some species like Megastrea ondosa and sea cucumber, Parasticopus parvimensis, but then in 2012, they also crashed. So what's happening in the fishery now is that some of the fisheries are closed, and this includes the sea urchin and the abalone. They had to strongly reduce their quota for sea cucumber and sea snail. And what is going really strong is still lobster and gelidium, this red alga. Because of the increasing value and access to some new markets that actually happened, they're almost compensating for these losses just with the lobster fishery. And in fact, they call it oro rojo, red gold, because basically this is right now the engine of the cooperatives. However, these systems, these fisheries have gone from having a portfolio of different resources to relying on one. And so the risk, again, becomes higher because if anything happens with the lobster, basically that's what their businesses rely on. So I've talked a lot of this event up here, this prolonged low oxygen event that happened in 2010. That coincided with very low temperatures throughout the season. With the physical monitoring, we've seen that in subsequent years, conditions varied a lot from year to year. So we have had, for example, two events here in 2012. These are the blue squares for the temperature, which is the red time series. Extreme high temperature in 2012 and 2014 during the summer. We had other low oxygen event that in some cases coincided with high temperature and in other cases didn't, like in the previous case. So every year seems slightly different, and at least as a correlation, we can't establish necessarily cause-effect relationship, but the mortalities coincided with either prolonged low oxygen or with these recent heat waves. There's also, in addition to temporal variability in this condition, there's very strong patterns of local variation, spatial variation in physical conditions. And for example, this is, again, it's an outline of Isla Natividad, and like many islands, has a cold, upwelling-dominated side, and then a warmer side that looks towards the Vizcaíno Bay, and so has very different condition. And for example, this is a time series of temperature on the warm, in red, and the cold side of this island. And at some point in time, you can have a difference of up to 8 degrees. And these two sides are only a few kilometers from each other. So very, very intense local variation. The cold side also has cold, high salinity, low oxygen waters coming up more frequently than the other. Similarly, there's very high variation in oxygen concentration at the bottom. These are time series from mini dots that are these small sensors that record temperature and oxygen. In summer 2014, we put a bunch around the island, and there's a low, so in one side, there's this prolonged low oxygen event, and then in another one, these pulses. So very different regimes, again, of exposure to stressor at a very local scale. So to assess how this variability might affect some measure of the performance of abalone, in this case survivorship and growth, we took some juvenile green abalone from the aquaculture facility that's on the island, and we put them out at different sites in these cages with instruments next to them so that we can see how survivorship and growth varies and how that might correspond or not with low oxygen event or high temperature. And so what we found, we did this first experiment in 2013, and survivorship, which is here, this is the number of dead animals, so its survivorship is very good when the numbers are low, was very good everywhere except for these 2 mortality events at one of the sites. At that one site, during the mortality event, we saw a very rapid change in temperature. The temperature weren't high, but changed relatively quickly. And so we did this experiment. This is, again, is Charlie that I can embarrass again in the lab. Essentially, we took juveniles, and we brought down to the island this temperature control system that we borrowed from Steve Polambia, Hopkins Marine Station, because he uses a similar system for corals to look at how they respond to bleaching. So there's a temperature control with a heater and a chiller and a feedback system so that you can maintain more or less these temperature ramps and this temperature difference. So we exposed the juveniles to a temperature ramp that was similar to what we had seen in the field, basically asking the questions, if they see this change, do they die or not? And the answer is that they don't die. In fact, all of them survived, but there's significant stress symptoms, so signs of physiological stress. And so here, this is what Charlie is doing there at the microscope. You essentially take hemolymph sample from the animals after they have been exposed to the temperature ramp, and then you dye them with trypan blue, and if the dye gets into the cell, it means that the membrane is damaged, and then you can look at the percent of cells that are damaged as an indicator of stress. And so with that rapid increase in temperature, there was a significant increase in cell damage. However, after 24 hours, they recover, they don't die, their behavior changes here, they can't right themselves, they're more sluggish, but then they recover completely. So that's why I was mentioning that these effects, when they result in mortality, are probably indirect, not direct effects of temperature. We repeated the experiment in 2014 when there was a big heat wave and a lot of storms, so very different conditions. For 2014, we saw hypoxia, we saw high temperatures, we saw storms, so all of the stressors at the same time, very different than the previous year, which was relatively benign. And in this case, we saw much higher mortality everywhere and low growth. So I'm showing this because I think it's a beautiful movie, and this again is Charlie's work at Mbari. He has now moved to Mbari as a postdoc, and because of the incredible facilities there, he's now able to dissect the effects of all these different stressors on different life stages of red abalone in this case. So, for example, these are videos that he did of spawning. So you see the female, the male. We can now spawn the animals in the lab. So this is sort of an accelerated time lapse of the lab experiment, one of the lab experiments where the animals are spawned in the laboratory, and then the gametes are exposed to different combinations of low pH, low oxygen, and then you look at fertilization rates in this case. And so this is like the kitchen of an Italian restaurant. I love this, that it's crazy, everything happens, it needs to be very fast, and then and you eat pizza at the end. Basically, this is the experiment, and then, whoops, this is going, sorry, I go. And then the project that involves Jim Berry, Giulio De Leo, various investigators here, basically we decided to narrow in on one species and really look at how multiple stressors affect different life stages. What are the bottlenecks? How do you scale up to population consequences with the modeling tools that we've used in Baja? So we will do similar experiments on the larvae and the post-larvae and the juveniles, and sort of try to dissect the effects of the multiple stressors. So from the work so far, at least the current hypothesis is that the animals are affected either by multiple stressors or rapid change. So the temperature, I haven't shown the result of another experiment that we did. The temperature that are seen, for example, right now with the ENSO conditions, do not result in mortality. In fact, there's greater growth. For example, for abalone, it's either a rapid change to which they can't acclimate rapidly or the multiple stressors. So this is our current hypothesis that we're going to test. There's very high variability among sites, life stages, and different individuals. And in fact, this might result in safe spaces. And when we did field experiments at the different sites, there's some conditions that consistently seem better. And so one of the challenges is, even at this local scale of a community, identify areas that might, in fact, provide better conditions for the survival and recovery of these animals, and then use tools like marine reserves or outplants of juveniles grown in the lab to try to recover populations. So what's happening right now is that we are seeing a condition that in the media has been called the Godzilla El Niño. This is the ENSO index time series from the 80s, so you can see the 97, 98 El Niño, and then this is the index rising to similar level. Locally, this is causing very high temperatures. We were diving with Charlie in September in Natividad, and we saw temperature of 25 degrees at the bottom, so it's very warm already. So far, very similar to what happened in 2014 because of the warm blob, the local warming, not because of El Niño, but the conditions right now are very similar, and we have to see how they develop. So the prospects, at least for this community, are not very good because they are still facing very challenging conditions for species that have been for years the real economic engine of what they do. And so in Isla Natividad, for example, as one example, the cooperative has invested a lot in different adaptation strategies, basically, that could be defined. So they have expanded their small laboratory into an aquaculture facility. They're experimenting with integrated aquaculture. They want to try to grow abalones, sea cucumbers, and macrocystis, to use the different feeding modes and to try and increase production in a more efficient way. They have upgraded their fish processing plant so that it's now certified, and they can sell to US markets even the finfish. They got the yellowtail listed in the sort of green list for the Seafood Watch from the aquarium, and they're working to try to find buyer in the US to buy it for a higher price. They're trying to grow pearls in the lab, so lots of different things. Other cooperatives are not doing this. And in fact, Maddalena last year decided to reopen its marine reserves. And so they're actually stepping back and say, we're going back to fishing resources before the levels get too low. No, there's nothing we can do about climate change. So in addition, I won't get into the detail of the work we're doing with the social scientists, but this is Juan Camilo Cárdenas from Colombia. He's an expert in economic game experiments. And so this past summer, with the postdoc Elena Fink-Beiner here from Stanford. They have gone in all of the communities and basically have done games where people play for money. So each of these yellow squares symbolizes a pink abalone because it's amarillo in Espanol. We use the yellow. But basically, they do rounds where they're given different scenarios. For example, in one scenario, you roll a dice. And depending on the number, there's a poacher coming in and taking a certain number of abalone. And in other rounds, they don't have these external threats. So we've done different kinds of experiments, and the intention of this, the goal, is to see if we can get a better understanding of what drives the different responses of communities. Now, why are they doing different things, and how they might respond to future changes. So if we go, for example, to our expectations, we've seen that ecologically, really what we're seeing so far is the winners and losers scenarios. Lobsters are doing great, finfish is doing great, but then other species are declining. There's also a range of behaviors that so far range from constrained action when they try to do some things, but then they had to basically step back to adaptation. And some of the variables that seem to emerge from the interviews and the game theory experiments, it's trust, how much they believe in the cooperative system and in their leadership is a big factor. Income, of course, how they perceive their resource level. Can they spare resources to do things that are risky? Communication, how they communicate with each other, and also their understanding of what's going on. For example, we saw that in the cooperative where they have a really good understanding of how productivity functions and what exploitation does to population. They have very different responses, and their goal becomes maintaining the resources. So they're willing to actually take much less, and this is real money that they take in the game. And they say our goal is to maintain the resources because then we do better on the next round. So they change frame of mind depending on what they know. So in conclusion, I cannot stress enough how important is the participatory model for this kind of research. It's the participation that doesn't mean letting people know what you're doing, but actually doing it together, designing it together. So that has worked to very different degrees, very well in some cases and not in others. But when things have worked, it's because of participation. There's a big challenge, I think, that I'm trying to tackle in different ways, but I love to have more conversations about this, because it's how do we scale up these lessons? Every system is very particular, and Baja is a very particular system. And there's an attempt now, for example, to export tenure rights systems or cut shares to lots of different fisheries. For example, this is called the Vibrant Ocean Initiative. Bloomberg, who is the former mayor of New York, Michael Bloomberg, has a foundation. They put 53 million into a project that unfortunately doesn't involve us, actually, to implement exclusive access rights or cut shares in many different fisheries in Brazil and the Philippines. And so I think it's very important to understand under what conditions this might work, how do you do it, and so how do you scale up from the specific studies? I think it's a very important future direction. And then I think that it's important now, going back to my introduction, I think it's very important to remember that there's global problems, but there's also local actions that can at least mitigate effects of climate change. And it's important to understand what drives these initiatives and how they function under different contexts. So, whoops. Thank a lot of people, because, of course, there's many, many different people that are involved in this. And take any questions you may have. Yes?
One of the things you said was looking at the switch in the targeted species to lobsters. The finfish, they do not work much, and my experience down there was a few of the fishermen, the pescators, go after finfish, but they're really kind of a secondary status. And I'm trying to think about the seasons because they follow the fishing seasons pretty closely the way we do. What about the rest of the year?
The rest of the year, first of all, they try to have people working on different things. So, for example, lobster season ends in February. They used to have, they still do in some cases, March to July, then they have sea snail and sea cucumber, and then in September they're back to lobster. So if you are a member and you have access to this fisherman, you're busy almost year round, and then when you're not, because when Senado is your family and But what happened where this doesn't work is that during that time is finfish. And so that while the value is still very low and has been a secondary activity, there's a lot of shifts now towards finfish because it's better than nothing, but also because there's all this project to try. One of the cooperatives, La Purissima in Punta Eugenia, is trying the ship live fish. So they have this chillers and this big tanks where they keep them alive, and as they're working very hard to try to increase the value. That's and then as people that move away and or they do other jobs, they go and work in the city and then they come back for the season. So there's all sorts of different things that are done, but it's shifting more pressure on the finfish in general.
So I thought it seemed like a marine reserve idea, the main benefit of that would be that the fishermen were taking large abalone, so you get more reproductive output in the reserve. Had you tried, or did they suggest with the more traditional, which didn't work very well either, but maybe if you actually enforced it, it would, set lower size limits and take them, rather than having a reserve, because they have fish there, but we're going to all agree to reduce the size limits.
They not, because we discussed some of these things. In fact, other alternatives were to do artificial aggregations, because we tried to do all sorts of different ideas, but then what happened is that the densities got so low that there was no fishery and no ability to experiment on this. And so this is completely my personal opinion, so we haven't been able to really see when that switch happens, but it seems to me to go from relatively healthy fisheries, for example, Abucana, Reobus, they're all doing very well. So there isn't a concern, they're not that interested in marine reserves, or in changing their regulations, to a crisis. And that happens very quickly, and there isn't much time to try different things. So that would be my... We tried in the modeling simulations to have a slot limit, so which is the same. So what if you have a size limit that protects the largest spawners? So you don't set up a reserve, but you have to leave the largest animals there. And this is a model, of course, so it has to be taken with a lot of caution. But the reserves perform the better, and I think what happens just intuitively is that, of course, the animals to become large have to go through all the different stages, and by the time they get there with low population densities, there are enough spawners. So that might be, but in conditions where you haven't got to such low densities, that might work well too. So it's something definitely to think about.
I was wondering why the hypoxic events didn't affect the lobster populations like they did the abalone and the snails.
Yes, in general, no, we would try to see what life is. I think the simplest cutoff there is that animals that move, because there's so much patchiness, they can actually get away maybe fairly quickly from those conditions, and species that are sessile and sedentary are affected depending on where they are and what varieties are patchy. But so there might be an explanation that lobster are mobile and they can escape those conditions. And the same with finfishes.
What about if you took some of the artificial spawn that you guys make for the abalone and put that in places where you don't actually get a lot of recruits? What if you do artificially with that?
Yes, so that is one of the things that we would love to do, and maybe we will get to do now experimentally in La Bocana, because they're interested in our plants. And in Isla Natividad and in the past in El Rosario, they have done outcomes, but without any kind of documentation, experimental design, so we don't know how well they have worked. The genetic data suggest that, in fact, in some cases it might be successful in terms of having animals that survive, and it has resulted in a very strong signal of reduced genetic diversity, because they spawn a few adults and then go out. So it's not, again, it's more of an interesting pattern than an answer, but in fact, I think if it's done and if it works, we need to be very careful what it means in terms of the adaptation potential of the population.
We're trying that with green abalone in San Diego, working with Carlsbad farms, and we were working with the Navy for a while. And one thing we found is putting out 300, 400, 500 survivorship was 1 or 2 you might find. And the attrition, the mortality rates were so high, you had to do it with tens of thousands. And I don't know if they're really equipped, if they have the infrastructure there yet to do that.
No, we try with cages, we leave them out for months, they all come, and of course the spring this past year was very, was hard, and so they got, so, yeah, I don't know, but I think what might have happened in some of these places is that they've done year after year after year after year for 15 years. And so maybe cumulative you get some survivorship. The investment, I think that someone needs to do the economics and see if actually they're better off growing them for 2-3 years. No? Small, because we can sell them smaller from agriculture on land rather than throwing them on the ocean with the cost of electricity and all that. I think it might be actually more cost effective to just go for aquaculture and try to recover the natural populations in different ways with protection, maybe with artificial habitat to try to increase recruitment, other approaches that don't rely on the outline. So these are important questions because the communities, of course, are very, very interested. And so the hope is that we can actually design some experiments now in Baja California and do it in these 2 locations, and actually test some of these alternatives and see which one might be more promising on the future.
So, what does the how are these fisheries actually regulated now? Is it pretty much up to you to do whatever they want, or is there an equivalent of fishing game or fish and wildlife service that steps in and
There's actually another level because there's a cooperative, some have a federation, and so there's a federation of the group, which is Guadalupe and the Vizcaíno, are all under FEDECOP, they're all in federation, and then there's the agency, fisheries agency, INAPESCA. And so the regulations are set by INAPESCA. The cooperative negotiates things like quotas. So there's a negotiation that happens, for example. Yeah, they propose a quota and they negotiate, so it's because it's conventions. And then the cooperative can decide to have more restrictive regulations. They can, for example, they've changed their size limits with respect to the mandatory. They've shortened some of the seasons we have to recover the alone in the past. So they've done things like that. The FEDECOP can also set up other regulations. Sometimes they go to the agency with some proposals to do things different, marine reserves. And they know we're going to, it's voluntary, it's not acknowledged by law, it's a voluntary reserve, and they come up with it also. It goes back and forth, there's regulation, but there's also some room for initiatives that are local, in fact, that have different copies.
Sounds like they're doing better in California than why don't you help out here?
I think every time it changes, might not be a bad idea. Because now it's very impressive. Some of the things, now, wouldn't you say, Charlie, that some of the things that they do and some of the, how they make decisions collectively, and no, it's a humbling experience to be there and see how they make decisions in some cases, or what they decide with, which is really contrary to their short-term interest, for sure. It's very interesting.
So final question for me. So you said that the abalone and urchins died off due to hypoxia. Is it possible that they died from a disease and their desiccation caused the hypoxia instead?
See, we don't know that they died of hypoxia. It's just not that these things happened in the same year. That's the extent to which we're confident about. We initially ruled out the possibility of the disease because there were different species, Canada, the mollusks, and they all died at the same time. So, but on the other hand, now there's 20 some species of sisters that die all at the same time. So, no, I don't know, it could have been a disease, or it could be a disease that maybe is triggered by, at least now become symptomatic because of stressful conditions. It could be something entirely different. No, we don't know, but in the laboratory with hypoxia, we've shown with post-larvae that there's some decrease in survivorship, but with the juveniles, not with the adults. With the adults, anecdotally, I think, Charlie, you were saying that you've seen them recovering the things. So just by accident and body, the adults, they were not, after the spawning were held there, so very low oxygen levels. When it was raised back, they fully recovered. So it's still, I think, I think that might be an indirect effect, where they're stressed and then something else happens, for example, high temperature, a disease, storms that cause sand movements and they can't move away from the crevice, something else.
Well, all right. Thank you, Gil.
Thank you
Very
very
nice.